morning, Santa Clarita. You're listening to your hometown station, AM 1220 KHTS. I am attorney Wade Skalsky, and this is Wade Beyond the Courtroom. Today, joining me on the board is Mike. Mike, how are you?
Doing well. Just kind of rifling through some stuff here.
Good.
Trying to figure it out.
Yes. We're having some technical difficulties in our new studio. We're trying to get one of our call-in guests. So as we try to effort that, we're going to talk a little bit today about Uber and perhaps some of the implications that are coming down from some recent rulings. But also, we're going to talk about how Newhall downtown is just jamming today, Mike. I actually had a difficult time getting a parking spot this morning, and it was, I was like, wow, it's like Newhall downtown kicking on a Sunday.
Why do you think that is?
I'm not sure, really. I think it's, I don't know, the weather's nice. It's not too hot. I jinxed ourselves, and I was basically saying to my wife that the summer wasn't too bad. But in fact, we were having I jinxed us because then it was blisteringly hot yesterday. So. But anyway, Mike, have you ever taken an Uber before?
I have not. A lot of my friends take it, though.
Okay.
And they swear by it.
Yeah, well, so for those who don't know what Uber is, Uber basically is a crowd, I don't know if it's a crowdsourcing, but I think they call it a crowd employment service where anybody that qualifies, basically, they go through the qualification process with Uber. They can use their own car. Basically, they become their own taxi, I guess. And it's flourishing because people can do it part-time. It's actually very popular in the creative community in terms of like actors do it because they can basically create their own hours. It's funny. We would go to some shows with some friends, and after the show, we would be like, that was a great show. And we would talk to the actors after how they felt and like, well, it was good talking to you guys, but we have to go now. We have to go work at Uber. So I was like, man, I mean, it's a good thing and a bad thing that you're able to do that. But anyway, so basically, the reason why we're talking about Uber today from a legal standpoint is California Uber drivers are treated like independent contractors.
Right.
So if you don't know what an independent contractor is, Mike, basically it's a designation to where if I hire you on a contract basis, I don't have to provide benefits for you. So I don't have to provide, I don't have to pay payroll taxes on you. I don't have to provide you any insurance. I don't have to do any of those things. Basically, all I do is I pay you for your service, and there's no other expense for me.
No license as well.
Correct. Right. So in effect, as a employer, it's very good to use contract workers from that perspective. Sure. Because you don't have any extra costs. The one issue, though, is that there are very few protections for the drivers then at that point, or for any contract worker, because if you're not protected from me in any way effectively, other than obviously I can't do anything illegal, but you don't have the certain protections that you would if you were an employee. Like certain laws don't apply to you that would apply to you if you were my employee. So California, actually, what we're going to talk about after the break is that California basically made a ruling that Uber employees in certain circumstances were actually employees and they weren't 1099. There can be situations where it doesn't matter what I call you. I can call you whatever I want as an employer, but if you do certain things or I do certain things and we cross a threshold, then it doesn't really matter that if I call you a 1099, you actually can become an employee.
Right.
So sometimes an example of this is that people will go to work for a new employer and they'll put you like on a probationary status. Have you ever experienced that? I actually experienced that as a lawyer for 3 months. I was a contract attorney for 3 months. Like, we're going to put you on a probationary status, and then after that, then if we like you, we'll bring you full time. Well, all that is basically is it's an attempt to say, okay, if we hire you and then we don't like you and we fire you, then actually that has all sorts of issues with unemployment insurance. We have to do all these situations with regards to it's harder to fire someone than it is simply to terminate a 1099 contract employee.
Right.
So basically, you can't just look at someone and say, all right, I'm going to call you a 1099 contract employee and do that for like 5 years when actually, in effect, you're actually an employee. So when we come back from the break, we're going to talk a little bit more about how that is going to impact Uber, and you're listening to your hometown station, AM 1220 KHTS. Welcome back, Santa Clarita. You're listening to your hometown station, AM 1220 KHTS. I am attorney Wade Skalsky, and this is Wade Beyond the Courtroom. So, Mike, we're going to try to bring a caller in right now. He's a professor of law, or professor at law, Joseph Master Simone. Joe, can you hear me?
And that would be a no.
That's a no, I
So
think.
we'll work on that.
All right, we're working on that. We're efforting the technical difficulties here in our new studio. We were going to break in the new studio with a caller. It's an old friend of mine who I actually went to law school with. It's crazy. After you sort of, I guess the requirement is age enough, then your friends start to accomplish prestigious things like become professors of law. So hopefully we can get Joe back. He's a professor of law, and he is an expert on employment law. He can hear us, but we can't hear him. So it's the one time in life to where my friend Joe...
We may have lost him.
We may have lost him. It's my one time in life where my friend Joe is forced to listen to me and he cannot retort. But we'll see if we can get him back. So before the break, we were talking about Uber. We were talking about how... in California, that there's been a ruling that they're trying to make them basically be Uber drivers, employees. And it's actually kind of a big deal. Uber's fighting it right now. But if Uber loses this, they might have to pay $209 million, basically 10% of its revenue that they're going to have to pay back to the state of California if indeed all of those Uber drivers are deemed to be employees. It's also an interesting situation because Uber is actually based out of California. Their headquarters are here, from what I understand. So it would be a very interesting situation if California decided to suspend Uber's operations in California simply because Uber calls their drivers one thing and California disagrees and calls them another. So that's why anytime that you're starting a business, it's important that maybe you try to make sure that you're dialed in on these issues with regards to how you operate, your business model. And that's why if you run afoul of these issues, this could have a giant impact on Uber's operations. So another issue about it too that's interesting is that Uber actually had this large workforce that it has, basically of independent contractors. Now California is trying to make it be employees. If California succeeds in calling them all employees, classifying them that way, then what do you think all the other states are going to do, Mike? They're all going to say, hey, we want to get into that tax base in terms of the employment taxes, in terms of not just the normal, whatever sales tax may apply, but also we want to get into those employment tax issues with regards to, we pay into, if I have an employee, we pay into the employment insurance so that if that person gets fired, then they can take unemployment. Well, that's a lot of money, $209 million. So other states are going to want to do this as well. I know that there's a big fight going on in New York right now. So anytime, and actually in Paris, I believe Paris has suspended the use of Uber drivers because the taxi drivers are getting all upset. So anytime that you have a new venture or a new business come into the marketplace like this, because basically Uber's trying to change the way that traditional business is done. You're looking at a scenario where for the longest time, taxi service was taxi service. If you had a limo service, it was very similar. You would basically, or a town car service or whatever, they all operated under the same model. Well, then this technology comes into play, and now you're able to actually flip it on its head, where you're like, okay, what we're going to do is that we're going to farm out the entire labor force, and we're basically just going to facilitate putting people together. Because in the end of the day, that's all that Uber really is. It's just a clearinghouse. It's kind of like a job version of eBay. I mean, when eBay came onto the scene, I don't know if you remember this, people were kind of wary of it, but all of a sudden, you could literally find anything you wanted because you had access to whoever was on eBay.
Right.
So all eBay had to do was say, we're going to expand our base of people who use our service, and the more that we expand, the better our service gets. Because then people have more access to whatever it is they're looking for.
Right.
So if you're looking for like a Johnny Bench rookie card or something like that, or make it even not even Johnny Bench, let's use someone like really, really super obscure. You know what I'm saying? Like if you wanted, I keep thinking of famous people now, but you wanted an obscure rookie card from like 1984 in mint condition, you could literally, that was in some sort of Topps bubblegum package, you could literally type that into eBay and it will come up. I was trying to give a friend of mine, basically their dad had played was the quarterback for the Denver Broncos in like 1973 or something like that, and he had passed away. And so I was trying to give a gift to them, but he was, I don't know if he was like third string, but I had never heard of him. No one had ever heard of him, and I could actually get things about him from eBay, even though I couldn't find it anywhere else in Los Angeles. So to kind of bring this back around, to circle back to what we're talking about, all eBay had to do in that scenario is increase its number of people who use the service, and then the service became more valuable because then it became able to be more complex and to satisfy more need. Uber is very similar. When Uber first came out, basically what would happen is that you wouldn't, like, very first came out, you could get an Uber car, but sometimes you'd have to wait, a few, 10 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever to have an Uber driver come pick you up, because it was just in its infancy. They didn't have that many drivers. Well, fast forward to now, where apparently everyone's an Uber driver now, and you literally can get an Uber driver in like 3 minutes, and you can start to pick your car if you want a really nice car, or if you want a regular car.
Right.
And so, it's fascinating that all Uber's trying to do is it's not trying to hire employees. It vets them, so obviously they don't get these people who are going to, hopefully drive you into the desert and you never come back again. So they do have a pretty intense verification process. But all they have to do, though, is just increase the number of people that use it, and then they increase the value of the service without actually having to train their own drivers, without actually having to go through all of that process.
Right.
It's an open source employee process that actually starts to feed on itself, because there's really no limit to the amount that it can grow.
And the cab drivers aren't happy about it as well.
No, they're very unhappy about it because it's competition.
And I've taken cabs lately, and I haven't been overly impressed with the way I've been treated.
Well, that's because the taxis are sort of especially in Santa Clarita, it's not like we have a bustling million taxis up here like you do, down in LA itself is a lot different. On the East Coast, I went to law school in George Washington University, and in DC, there's cabs everywhere. That's how people got around. The thing about it, though, is that the difference is with Uber is that it's very difficult for there to be sort of hijinks from the cab driver, because, for instance, in D.C., they were on a zone system when I was there, so they would just charge you by how many zones you went through. They didn't charge you by the actual number of miles that you went with the meter. So if you didn't know the zones, a driver could take advantage of you by saying, well, we went through 3 zones, we only went through 2, or he could take a way that's kind of a windy way that actually puts you through going 2 or 3 zones when you really only need to go 2. So
Right.
We'll talk a little bit more about this interesting topic of 1099, Uber, eBay, and all these things of open source employment.
It's riveting.
When we come back from the break. You're listening to your hometown station, AM 1220, KHTS.
You have to wonder what Johnny Cash would do
Right.
on mornings like this.
Absolutely. Welcome back. You're listening to your hometown station, AM 1220, KHTS. I am attorney Wade Skalsky, and this is Wade, Beyond the Courtroom. I had a little, preteen voice crack right there. It was good. I felt like I was 13 again. So we are back. Before we went to break, we're talking a little bit about Uber and some 1099 issues, which is radio gold. When you look up radio gold in the dictionary, Mike, 1099 tax issues is where you should start. But on the line right now, we have a good friend of mine. I think we've solved our technical difficulties. Joseph Master Simone, a law professor, a good friend of mine from law school and former golfing buddy. Joe, are you there?
I'm here, Wade.
Oh,
yes.
There we are.
All right,
Okay.
finally got you. The audience got
It's
you.
ironic to be talking about technology and not be able to have a phone work.
That's right. That's right. Well, all the phones were working. It's just all these bells and whistles in our new studio. We were having some issues in figuring them out.
It's state of the art, but we don't know who Art is.
Right. Exactly. Well, let's get right to it, Joe. And management has just told me, actually, we got a Morse code message that we may be getting some bonus Wade Beyond the Courtroom today because we're so fascinated by the topic, but especially interested to have you on. So, Joe, talk to me a little bit. When we finally got you on, you said that I was 98% correct. Let's start with where I was wrong.
Well, I guess where everyone's wrong on this, in my mind, is this is nothing new, right? I mean, the idea of taxi cab drivers and whether they're employees or independent contractors predates Uber by about 40 or 50 years. Taxi drivers have been fighting this fight for a long time. And in fact, most of them, with some exception, California being one of them, but most states find that taxi cab drivers, because of the way that they are structured and the limited amount of supervision that they have, that they lease their own vehicles, that they're not employees, that they're independent contractors.
So is it fair to say then when Uber was looking at its model, they said, well, this is easy. This law has already been looked at, delineated. They're obviously going to be independent contractors because for 50 years that's what taxi drivers have been. We're just changing it up a little bit because we're just going to be expanding the pool of taxi drivers?
I think that's right. In fact, I would imagine in Uber's mind, they thought they were even on safer ground because they view themselves as being one step further removed from the taxi cab company, right? They do see themselves, and they sort of talk even in the California decision, how they describe what Uber does, is that they really see themselves as providing a platform to connect a person who wants to give someone a ride to connect someone who needs a ride. And that's really all they do in their mind.
So amazingly,
I think they would even fight the argument that they don't even consider themselves a taxi cab company.
So in my analogy of kind of eBay, it was kind of actually surprisingly spot on, because that's all that eBay does, is it just says someone has a want, and we're going to put someone who can fulfill that want. We're just going to put them together. We're just a clearinghouse basically for those two things.
It was really hard to hear you there. It's very low volume now.
Oh, I apologize. So I was saying
There we go.
So my eBay analogy then was sort of spot on in terms of all that Uber is arguing is that all they're doing is they're a clearinghouse of putting people with a desire together with someone who can fulfill that desire, and that's all that they do.
That's exactly right. I mean, that is if you were Uber's lawyer, that's the argument that they are making. That our model of business is that all we provide is this sort of platform and connect people who need services. Someone who wants to provide the service, this individual person who has a car, and this person on the street corner who doesn't want to flag a cab down and hope to get one, but wants to sort of sit inside the restaurant, push a button on their smartphone, and then the car arrives.
So as part of the challenge then for Uber right now, like twofold. One is that the system, California is trying to grapple with the technology itself, number one. So they're like, okay, does the technology aspect of it change what's happened over the last 50 years, but also maybe there may be some political pressure, because I'm assuming that the taxi drivers and their lobby and all those companies aren't very happy about Uber coming in on their business, because I'm sure...
Oh, yeah, I think they're getting it both ways, right? I mean, in California, it's both, right? Because California doesn't necessarily adopt the traditional rule that taxi cab drivers are not employees. In fact, the Ninth Circuit recently overruled a ruling from the National Labor Relations Board finding cab drivers were independent contractors, and the Ninth Circuit said, no, they're not. So California has this sort of rule out there already, and now you have Uber coming along, and it's really, in a sense, applying its slightly different traditional rule to Uber and saying, well, yeah, these folks are employees because they're actually performing a service for you, right? Uber doesn't exist if people don't drive cars and pick up people who want an Uber ride. And so that's the service they're providing. But they're certainly getting the political pressure, and that's where you see particularly in states like New York. I mean, to drive a taxi cab in New York, you need to buy a medallion, and that medallion can cost over $1 million. So you have all these people that have invested these huge sunk costs in becoming a taxi service, right? And you can't, once you buy that medallion, that's $1 million, and it takes a long time to pay that off. And here comes Uber, and all you need is an iPhone now, and all of a sudden they're cutting into the business that has been heavily regulated by New York City all these years. That had a large sort of entry cost to get into it, and now that those entry costs for Uber are essentially zero.
Yeah, I mean, I would be annoyed if I paid $1 million to have my own radio show, and then some college kid that was 19 years old had a smartphone, and he's doing live feeds from somewhere and getting on the radio. That would probably annoy me as well. So
right, if it was in your same area, right, and if it was interfering with your listenership, that would annoy you because you had these sort of costs planned out in mind. Like, okay, well, I'll invest this money, but I know I'll get a certain rate of return because I know that people in New York City need yellow cab drivers. There's just no way around it. And when the supply of yellow cab drivers, medallion cabs, is regulated, then that medallion has a certain sort of fixed price by what the market is, right? You know what that's going to be. Essentially, what Uber is trying to do is go around the regulated market and open up a vast supply of unregulated cabs, which is undercutting the value of the medallion.
Well, and there are two competing interests here, actually. One is the interest is, okay, Uber's going to argue that, hey, this is better for everyone. When I'm up here in Santa Clarita, where I live, we're Joe, you're in Kansas right now, which is, you're like the third person to live there, I think, right? From the census. Ouch. Hey, I grew up in North Dakota. I can make those jokes.
You're right. You can't complain, really.
That's right. No, but so up here, actually, it's hard to get a taxi up here because we're not a super populous place compared to Los Angeles. I mean, we're a suburb, but we're a little removed. Whereas now with Uber, actually, as a consumer, I have a lot more access to taxis now, and so that's good for me here. Whereas the two taxi companies up here, or whatever it is, or whoever services up here, would not like that because they go from being busy all the time to now they actually have to be nice to you when you call them. Because if they're the only game in town, you really don't have to worry about customer service in that way. So
right.
Those two interests are competing, and I just find that's fascinating. And politically, it's worldwide. I mean, there's problems in Paris, there's problems in Rome with Uber.
Yeah, the cab drivers in Paris went on a general strike to protest Uber's presence there. I'll even go one step further. What Uber is saying, not only are we providing a needed better service in that you don't have to go stand out in the rain on the street corner and flag down a cab in the middle of Los Angeles. Although, of course, it doesn't rain in Los Angeles, right? Mm-hmm. You don't have to stand outside in Los Angeles in the searing heat and flag down a cab. But Uber was in this argument in New York was saying, look, not only is it a better service, but it's a fairer service as well. There's studies that come out all the time that show that minorities have a difficult time flagging down a cab. That if you have a white male on a street corner and an African-American male on the street corner and they both flag the cab down, that cab driver, more often than not, is going to pick up the white male and not the African-American male. And Uber is saying, that's not a problem with us, right? Because someone hits on the smartphone, they're there, and that cab, that driver who accepts the fare is required to pick up that person who asked for it. And so in its sort of publicity campaign in New York to try to get around the limitations that New York was trying to impose on it, they were saying, look, we don't discriminate, unlike the cab services that New York has sort of regulated.
Well, and don't we want to
interesting little twist on it?
Yeah, and don't we want to encourage enterprise? Don't we want to encourage people to work and people to be able to be creative? I used an example before I had you on the air was that I have a bunch of friends who are actors. And so, the traditional acting job is I'm going to go work at a restaurant and then that's flexible enough to where I can go to auditions. But I know a lot of them, what they're doing is they're working on Uber and Lyft, which is a competitor, but we use Uber because it's the biggest as an example. And so they actually get to have an advantage because now they're not beholden to necessarily a restaurant job. They can go be an Uber driver, and that's as flexible as they want it to be. And so
that's right. And really it's that flexibility that sort of is the main part of Uber's argument for why these are not employees, right? They can choose when it is they want to come online. And Uber doesn't really care so long as at some point within, I think, 180 days, the driver actually logs onto the system. It doesn't really care if you want to work 1 hour a week or 1 hour a month or 8 hours a day. It relies on there being a lot of people who want to do this for a little bit of time. And so that flexibility to be able to say, well, yeah, I'm going to drive for a couple hours right now, and maybe I'll make some deliveries later on with my same car. That sort of choice, those are traditionally going to point towards an outcome that says this person is not an employee. Now, of course, that has a lot of ramifications for the driver, right? Uber could decide, I don't want to contract with this person, I don't want to hire them because of their religion or because of their race or gender, and then statutes like Title VII don't apply because they're not employees. Uber drivers would have a difficult time sort of forming a union to try to negotiate together with Uber to get maybe higher pay or higher sort of recapture rates on the fees because the National Labor Relations Board would consider them not to be employees. When you call someone an independent contractor, it has a lot of ramifications beyond just who pays the employment taxes.
And again, Uber drivers can't flag down fares. They can't park at an airport and advertise.
I'm sorry, it's really hard to hear you right now.
Okay, I'm saying that Uber drivers can't pick up fares from airports unless they've been asked to do so. They can't park there in a cab zone. And
right, because they're not a licensed cab company, right? So they have to act like more like a livery service where they can't sort of be in those places that are reserved for traditional medallion cabs.
And I don't want to go too much into the weeds with the law and in terms of getting real in the legal arguments, but let me ask you this question. Can't there an argument be made that says, okay, yes, this is all true for the 1099 for Uber, but there is an existing industry and marketplace if you want those types of protections, and that's a traditional cab service. So can't we have an economy that's complex enough to where we can have both? We can have, look, if you're going to go work for Uber, you're going to give up as a 1099 some of these protections, but we can allow you to do that because Uber is not the only monopoly of taxi services out there. There's a whole other industry. If you want those protections and you want to have a career as a taxi driver, then yeah, you can go over there. You can have the union protection. You can have all of those legal protections. Can't we have both of those in the marketplace, or is it one of those sort of where it's a zero-sum game?
Yeah, and I've been getting ready to talk to you today. I was looking at some articles, particularly in New York, because you see this argument going back and forth, and I think what you get from the cab companies is suggesting that it is more of a zero-sum game. That when you have Uber, which exists alongside of these other cab companies, and it's a strange argument they're making. Like Uber is so good at what it does that it endangers the existence of the traditional cab companies, and they envision a future where all you have is Uber.
And then it's sort of like
and
the
so now any
Wild
protections
West
that were associated with the traditional cab companies are gone because they don't exist anymore. And then Uber is then free to charge whatever it likes, because not only does Uber sort of do an end run around the regulation of employees, but it doesn't end run around because it's not a cab company. It doesn't fall under the regulations of what a cab service can charge. So I know you were talking on the line in D.C. about the zone system that used to exist, right? Imagine the zone system still existed. That wouldn't apply to Uber, of course, because Uber's not a cab company. Uber can charge whatever it likes, and in fact, it charges different rates depending on the time of day. It's almost like a hot lane on a highway. If there's more demand for its service, if there's more demand for rides, the fare goes up. They call it surge pricing.
And by the way, there's also Lyft. So can Uber and Lyft view each other as competition?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
There's also a company called Lyft, which does the same thing that Uber does.
So there's other companies getting involved trying to compete with Uber on this new sort of ride-sharing technology.
And that's sort of the argument I think that Uber would make is like, look, yeah, maybe the traditional cab companies, much like the Pony Express went out of business, right? But then there's going to be competitors that are going to come in that are going to offer better service, and then the consumer benefits from that. So this is going to be an unusual situation.
Let's take a break.
Let's take a break, and I think we're getting some bonus time on Wade Beyond the Courtroom. Usually we're from 10 to 10:30, but because of our technical difficulties today, we're going to be able to go a little bit longer. So, Joe, can you come back with us for one more segment?
Sure can.
All right, absolutely. Well, you've been listening to Wade Beyond the Courtroom. This is AM 1220 KHTS. I am attorney Wade Skalsky, and we'll talk to you in a bit.